Motions, committee chairs and other governors may join in the discussion. I'd like to call on Governor Branstad for a motion to approve the minutes of the May 16th Executive Committee meeting.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the minutes of the Executive Committee meeting of May 16th be approved.
Is there a second? Second. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Next, I'd like to introduce to our committee two very special people. As you know, the governors are fortunate to have some close friends in the White House. The President has also selected two outstanding assistants who serve as primary contacts with the governors of this country. The Honorable Deborah Anderson, Assistant to the President for Intergovernmental Affairs and former Speaker of the South Dakota House of Representatives, knows state government from the viewpoint of an elected official. Mr. Lanny Griffith, Special Assistant to the President and serves as a full-time liaison to the governors, is also present. Lanny is well known to most, if not all, of the Southern governors. Both have been very effective in raising the governor's concerns at the White House. I'd like to ask both of them to stand and to express to them our appreciation for being present today and for bringing their boss here on Monday. Lanny, thank you. And now let me move to the first order of business by painting the portrait of putting in context the theme of the National Governors Association's project for the year. Over the course of the past year, the nation's governors have undertaken a major six-part project called American Transition, the International Frontier. This project is based on a simple assumption that the world is growing smaller. Fiber optics span the continents, billions move in seconds from Tokyo to New York, goods move around the world in a single day. A century ago, it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. Today, it never sets on the stock markets and world markets facing our nation. Unfortunately, we have been slow to respond to these changes, taking our economic superpower status for granted. Too often we have assumed that the world of the past was our best guide to the future. But as the world grows smaller, we must develop a new way of thinking. As governors, we face the consequences of the international frontier every day in our states. Plants relocate overseas, farmers lose markets, and businesses lose potential buyers. For better or worse, we are part of the international economy. We must recognize and respond to these changes beyond our borders. The common market, long a goal in Western Europe, will soon become a reality. In 1992, Western Europe will become the largest market for goods and services in the world, creating new challenges for us, but also new opportunities for our businesses. As world output shifts to the Pacific Rim, we must rethink our trade, agricultural, and educational policies. So it's a new game with new players and high stakes for the states of this country. And during this past year, we have personally concentrated our time and our efforts on responding to these challenges. In the area of foreign markets, Governor Branstad and I led a delegation of 9 governors to Brussels to meet with the leaders of the European community and to discuss new trade opportunities. In April, Governor Mabus of Mississippi released the findings of his task force in conjunction with the Bretton Woods Conference. In the area of research and technology, Governor McKernan of Maine's report on research and technology made headline news, not only for its contents and its recommendations, but when President Bush held up a copy during the White House conference. Last December, 7 governors traveled down to the marshes of Florida to meet with NASA officials and watch the launch of the Atlantis Space Shuttle. In the area of international education, last February at the winter meeting, Governor Kane of New Jersey and his colleagues released their report spelling out ways how we can learn about the world in which we live and in which we must operate. In April, Governor Kane hosted an excellent conference in New Brunswick on international education. Within our borders, we have also been busy. Yesterday, Governor Thompson of Illinois released his report on infrastructure. And and pointed out that the problem is somewhat simple. Too many airplanes in the sky and not enough airports on the ground. Through a series of regional hearings, one in Chicago, one in Portland, one in Pittsburgh, Governor Thompson and his colleagues have learned how we can get more miles per gallon of concrete. In the domestic market area, Governor Blanchard of Michigan and his colleagues rediscovered the Yankee trader by taking the lessons learned in the automotive industry to increase our ability to sell American products here at home. And in the area of children, our future has always been in children because they are the doctors and the teachers and the scientists and the political leaders of the future. But unfortunately, too many of them die before their first birthday, too many of them discover drugs in the schoolyards, and too many become parents before they become adults. Bill Clinton and his colleagues have produced a report that I think will gain a great deal of attention around this country as Congress begins to debate a number of children-related issues. In April, Governor Clinton and Governor Casey of Pennsylvania hosted a 2-hour national teleconference on children's issues. 37 states participated, inspiring NGA to consider running their next annual meeting via satellite. But like a nation at risk, or the fragile foundations, the cornerstones and competition reports, the reports of this past year, I think, will make a difference. I want to thank each one of the members of the Executive Committee and the members of the National Association who've made this project a personal priority. I think we've made a good beginning. The reports are all off the drawing boards now, and in the hands of policymakers, I think it's up to us to make a difference. And now, I'd like to make a special introduction. As we promote our products abroad and seek out foreign investments here at home, we must know more about the international economy and its impact on our own. With us today is an individual who needs to monitor world finances on a daily basis. It is said that few individuals have more influence on this country's economic stability than the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Since assuming the chairmanship of the Federal Reserve Board in August of 1987, Alan Greenspan has steered a steady course, keeping interest rates low and holding inflation at bay. I'm told that our financial markets became nervous at just the rumor that he's planning another dinner with Secretary Mosbacher. But I am pleased to introduce Alan Greenspan, Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board.
Well, thank you very much, Governor. What I'd like to do this morning is to split my presentation essentially into two segments. The first is to try to flesh out the underlying forces which are creating this extraordinary shift in the world economy that has best characterized as moving all the countries closer to each other, and to explain as best I can why I think these trends are irreversible and will continue pretty much indefinitely into the future. The second part, I'd like to just expose myself to whatever questions you might have, either on monetary policy or anything that might be related. But as a number of my friends know, that if you think that I was unduly clear or unambiguous on the issue of interest rates or exchange rates today, I've obviously made a mistake. So what I might add at this stage is hopefully a very broad background on a number of issues. But what I'd like to do first is to start on this question of what I think is a really very fundamental change that is in the process of occurring on the world scene, and is something which perhaps more profoundly than any other major event is going to govern our lives over the next quarter century. And this is the issue which I've raised several times recently with a number of groups which are related to this issue. And I'd like to raise it this morning, and it's the perhaps most profoundly important structural change that has happened to international trade and, in fact, world politics as well. And it is essentially the trend towards the downsizing of economic output in this world. Economic value creation has shifted increasingly toward conceptual and impalpable values with decidedly less reliance on physical volumes. A half-century ago, for example, we had radios which were bulky and activated by large vacuum tubes. Today, owing to the insights into the basic underlying roots of modern electronics, the same function is served by a pocket-sized transistor pack. As the governor mentioned earlier, we've got this extraordinary shift towards fiber optics, which is becoming a tremendously important element in telecommunications, but is in fact replacing vast tonnages of copper. Advances in architecture and engineering and the development and use of lighter but stronger materials now gives us the same working space in newer buildings with a lot less concrete, glass, steel, and a variety of other things that were required in an earlier era. Space heating technology has allowed the reduction in the fabric weight of apparel, which in turn was fostered by major advances in chemical technology. The considerable increase in the economic well-being of most nations in recent decades has come about without much change in the bulk or weight of the gross national product. In fact, if we were able to weigh all of the materials which we produce, the tons of grain, cotton ore, coal, steel, cement, and so forth, if these were all added up, their total volume per capita might not be much greater today than it was, say, 50 or 75 years ago. This would mean that increases in the conceptual components of the GNP, that is, those reflecting advances in knowledge and ideas, would explain by far the major part of the rise in real GNP in the United States and presumably the industrial world as a whole. In recent years, the conceptual contribution to economic activity has largely reflected the explosive growth in information gathering and processing techniques, which have greatly extended our analytical capabilities of substituting ideas for physical volume. These trends almost surely will continue into the 21st century and beyond. In the years ahead, telecommunications and advanced computing will take on an even greater role. By facilitating the transfer of ideas, they create value by changing the location of intellectual property, much like the American railroads in an earlier time created value by transferring physical goods to geographic locations where they were of greater worth. At the turn of the century, for example, we created economic value by moving ore and coal in a manner which changed the physical value, in the sense we moved the ore down from the Mesabi Range to the Pittsburgh district, where it was joined with coking coal and to produce steel. In today's environment, economic value is increasingly created by moving the conceptual part of GNP, not coal or ore, but data, analyses, and insights from one location to another through increasingly sophisticated electronic means. The purpose of production of economic value does not change. It serves human needs and values, but the form of output is becoming increasingly less palpable. One clear implication of economic product downsizing is a somewhat lessened concern over the depletion of finite natural resources in the face of growing populations. But of more immediate consequence is the implication of downsizing on international trade, which is having a profound effect on the policies of the world's economies. International trade in construction, gravel, and fiberglass insulation, for example, is limited by weight and bulk. High-value computer products, on the other hand, are major and increasing factors in world trade. Obviously, the less the bulk and the lower the weight, the easier it is to move goods. Specifically, the easier it is to move them across national boundaries. It's not, therefore, unexpected to find that the real economic value of trade worldwide has been increasing at a 5% rate, adjusted for inflation, since the 1970s. And this is far in excess of the underlying production that are going on in domestic economies. And if you look at our export and import data, it becomes very clear that this element of downsizing is having a very profound effect on what it is we ship out and what it is we bring back in. In fact, in both instances, when we look at the exports and imports of the United States, which in a way is representative of world trade, what we find is that after adjusting for inflation, that is, after adjusting for individual prices of goods, the actual pounds per real value of both imports and exports have been going down 3 to 4% a year. That is an extraordinary decline, which means that despite the tremendous increase in trade worldwide, the physical volume of that trade is actually increasing only very negligibly. It's all conceptual. It is all the types of things which are created by insights and not by putting things, physical things, together and moving them. The increased ease with which economic goods and services can spill over national borders creates a major dilemma for the political structure of a country inclined to inhibit such movement. The political leadership must increasingly accelerate the protectionist blocking of goods and services, or open up their economy to a more market-oriented and less domestically regimented system. Advancing technology is clearly creating pressure on autarkic political systems in areas beyond the realm of international trade and economic values. The development of satellite technology, for example, and the ability to transmit television pictures across national boundaries undercuts political censorship of the media. Governments must then either acquiesce in new political freedoms or produce increasingly harsh regimes. To date, however, the political response to the technological impact on trade has been, to a surprising extent, liberal. Glasnost has a foothold in Eastern Europe and perestroika worldwide. The increasing international economic pressures of recent decades have exposed the economic inadequacies of the centrally directed economies of the Eastern Bloc, and to only a somewhat lesser extent the partially centrally planned economies of the West. The breakdown of political barriers to the inexorable pressures of cross-border movements of economic goods is especially visible on the European continent. And the evolving, newly industrialized countries of the Far East, capitalizing on their ability to exploit the downsizing technologies of the 1980s, have flourished well beyond expectations. These models, in turn, have had a profound effect on other developing countries of the world, where discarding of centrally planned economies has accelerated, and the old heated so-called North-South political debates of a decade ago have faded. Countries, however, can eschew international economic cooperation. They can move in a severely protectionist direction, but the extraordinary downsizing of goods will make protectionism increasingly difficult to sustain in the years ahead, in the same sense that repressive national governments will have difficulty in blocking the satellite-transmitted flow of ideas to their people. Certainly a major world economic disruption could induce a hasty resurrecting of the protectionist walls of an earlier era. But technology is irreversible. The downsizing of goods will continue. As a consequence, the ability to suppress worldwide trade will become progressively more difficult in the decades ahead. But in this new evolving environment, can America maintain the preeminence in the next century that it has had during the past century? In the world of physical materials, America in the past has been associated with the skyscraper and huge hydroelectric complexes. The vast industrial complexes of Middle America were characterized at mid-century by our unquestioned dominance of the quintessential industry of the physical materials age, namely steel. But can the United States make it in the world of downsized products in the 21st century? The challenges are great, but history suggests we will meet them. Obviously, to the extent that economic value added is going to become increasingly conceptually oriented, the major capital of the next century is going to be minds that produce ideas. I certainly don't want to say to you that formal education is synonymous with the creation of a conceptually oriented workforce. American history is strewn with examples of great inventors with less than impressive formal educational credentials. Nonetheless, more and higher quality education must be presumed to be crucial in America's competition with our industrial partners for economic world leadership. But there are disturbing signs in American education. Many thoughtful observers are concerned that our students are not being prepared adequately to meet the demands of an increasingly sophisticated society. I do not underestimate the difficulty of turning the education system around, and I am sure that dollars alone are not enough. The issues are extraordinarily complex, and I wish here there were clear-cut answers, but regrettably there are not. While we may view idea-generating minds as the new economic capital of the next century, the old forms of capital, plant and equipment, will still play a significant role in the nation's ability to add conceptual value to an ever-increasingly downsized array of products. We must maintain a high level of business investment in order to equip our production facilities with the most up-to-date technology and machinery. But here too, as in education, recent trends have been disturbing. Investment net of depreciation, that is the portion of investment spending that actually increases the nation's capital stock rather than merely replaces worn-out equipment and structures, declined perceptibly as a share of GNP in the 1980s. Fortunately, while the recent experience has been discouraging, our history suggests that in the past we have saved and invested at much higher rates and hence can presumably do so again. Indeed, it would be difficult to explain how the United States evolved into the world's leading economic power if we did not outsave and outinvest our competition in decades past. In the period following the Civil War, when the United States began to emerge as an economic power, our saving and investment rates, as conventionally measured, were much higher than those in Europe and Japan. For example, between 1870 and 1910, domestic savings in the United States averaged close to 20% of our GNP. The best available estimates for Japan and Germany during that period placed their savings rates at about 15% or less. The saving rate in Great Britain, which was fading in preeminence, was closer to 10%. The shift toward a relatively and absolutely low U.S. savings rate began during the Great Depression when it fell dramatically. In the decades after World War II, it stabilized at a level slightly below its pre-depression average and has fallen further in the most recent period. Saving rates in Japan and Germany have declined some in the past 2 decades, but they remain substantially above those in the United States. The high savings rates in these countries have been mirrored in rapid rates of capital formation, which have helped them improve their competitiveness relative to the United States and close much of the gap in our living standards. I was brought up in an age when Americans could seemingly do anything we put our minds to. The current generation of younger Americans appears to me, if anything, to be more determined and skilled than those of us who reached adulthood at mid-century. However, they face important challenges to that determination and those skills. Among them is the challenge of a world economy that is increasingly complex and integrated. In meeting that challenge, we must stand together with our trading partners to ensure a continuation of the kind of constructive cooperation that contributes to the stability of the world economy and thereby to the prosperity of all. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for a very thoughtful and mind-challenging exercise in words about the future, the challenges that we face. I'd like to call on our Vice Chairman, Governor Branstad of Iowa, for the first question.
Thank you very much. Chairman Greenspan, we appreciate very much your coming and sharing with us your views on these global economic conditions and the importance of our being prepared to meet the challenge of competing successfully in these conditions. The governors yesterday heard the report of the Transportation and Infrastructure Task Force, which dealt with a problem here at home in terms of the transportation facilities needed to get our goods into the international marketplace. And we have a concern about the money that's been withheld or held back in the Highway Trust Fund and the Airport Trust Fund, and discussions in Washington about the possibility of raising motor fuel tax and using that not to fund transportation infrastructure needs, but rather as a deficit reduction mechanism. And the governors strongly oppose that kind of an effort, and in fact we object to the funds that have been withheld in those held back in those trust funds in order to reduce the size of the general fund deficit. I'd like to know your feelings about this, and if you expect there's going to be a continued push in this direction in the nation's capital.
This is an issue, of course, Governor, which has been going on for a number of years, and the question of the handling of the transportation trust funds has been one which has been thoroughly debated with, I must say, very little conclusion in recent years. I'm not sure I can add very much to the process. I mean, clearly the issue really relates to, as you point out, the simultaneousness, the obligation which is in statute, as I recall it, which requires that the transportation trust fund revenues be expended for transportation, but on the other hand, very significant unified budget deficit problem of which all the trust funds are in effect part. And we are going to have a very difficult problem of reconciling a number of such problems, not only in the transportation area, but elsewhere as well, if we are going to bring the basic budget deficit down. I don't think I can add very much to the general debate on this issue, and if I could, Governor, I'm not sure I should.
Second question, Governor Mabus of Mississippi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also like to tell Mr. Greenspan how much I appreciate his coming and his emphasis on the importance of minds and education, which we struggle with as governors every day. One of the factors that has a great impact on the states and our ability and our businesses' ability to manufacture and sell goods profitably, whether downsized or traditional, is the relative strength of the dollar as compared to other currencies. You touched on this very early in your speech. And could you elaborate a little bit more on Federal Reserve policies to encourage realistic exchange rates with other countries?
Well, Governor, the policy of the Federal Reserve is essentially directed at fundamentally maximizing long-term economic growth potential in the United States. And it is our conclusion that the stability of the currency domestically, that is the general price level, is a necessary condition to achieve maximum economic growth. And so that the fundamental focus of monetary policy is basically on a stable price level, hopefully achieving that sooner rather than later. The ability to achieve that will then create a overall exchange rate stability in the world if other central banks and governments engage in the same process. We have had many debates and discussions, not only in the academic fraternity, but amongst the G7 and the G10 governors around the world, of the governors of the central banks, on exactly what is the appropriate exchange rate and what is the one that, in a sense, maximizes economic growth worldwide, which means maximizes essentially trade, international trade. And we've all concluded several things. One, that leaving aside the question of the level of the exchange rate, a stable set of exchange rates is a highly desirable economic goal, because that enhances overall economic performance, and so far as the United States is concerned, that clearly fosters our domestic goals of maximum economic capability and efficiency in the context of a non-inflationary environment. So there is no conflict that exists there. We would like to see the dollar stable, and we'd like to see it stable in the context of broad economic policies which are non-inflationary. Everyone who has examined this issue comes to the conclusion that the best way to manage one's currency, if one wants to put it in that way, is to make certain that inflation is removed from the various different countries, because only under those conditions can we have a stable international financial system. And so I would say that is our formal goal. We do not very specifically focus on getting the exchange rate at a specific point, but we do believe that the markets will find the appropriate exchange rate, and a relatively stable one, if we can manage to keep our basic underlying economic policies of the United States and our trading partners in a sensible mode.
Thank you.
Next question, Governor Gardner of the state of Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I echo the feeling of others, which is your presence is one of the highlights of these sessions. And I want to applaud you for the lowering of interest rates and making the dollar more competitive. Our concern is that if inflation or the economy begins to overheat, those policies get reversed. And my question is as to what alternatives to the use of interest rates have been considered in combating inflation. Now let me add to that. By placing the emphasis on interest rates, you also place the burden not just in interest rates, but also on export states, and also at the same time shift the burden from wage earners to investment earners. So the issue of the alternatives to interest rates is one of considerable interest to us.
Well, Governor, I don't think there's a conflict between interest rate policy and inflation policy, because what the evidence suggests to us, I think, overwhelmingly, is that when inflation is kept under control, when it is basically constrained, interest rates are their lowest. And that the way in which we can keep interest rates, both nominal and real, meaning adjusted for inflation, at minimum levels over the long term is to make certain that we don't allow inflation to break through, to take on an accelerated expansion which becomes very difficult to suppress without very heavy constraints on the economy. So we don't view the issue as higher interest rates being the means by which one constrains inflation. On the contrary, we believe that higher interest rates are caused by inflation and inflation expectations, and the ideal monetary policy is the one which can constrain inflationary pressures and thereby keep interest rates down over the longer term.
Next question, Governor Cunin of Vermont.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Greenspan. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Like many governors, last week in the state of Vermont, we went over revenue estimates, and we do our own share of crystal ball gazing as we try to predict the future of our separate economies. And the gentleman doing the revenue estimating said, well, this is the forecast if Mr. Greenspan does everything right and fine-tunes, then we're in for a soft landing. And otherwise, the situation may be more serious. How optimistic are you about that soft landing, and how much control would you say that you have over that future?
All I can say, Governor, is so far things seem to be working reasonably well. I think it's a mistake for a central bank governor or a central bank chairman to be optimistic about anything. I mean, we always have, as part of our profession, sort of the looking at all of the things which can go wrong and try to construct policies which will prevent that from happening. You're really asking for a forecast, which I'm not sure we're able to do at this stage. I think what we can do is to try to govern policy in a manner which will seek to diffuse inflationary pressures and create a stable economic environment. Obviously, we work as hard as we can to achieve that goal. So far, the evidence is mildly positive that there is some success in that area. But I've been in the forecasting business for too many decades to be overly confident about our abilities to make precise forecasts about the future. So I wish to communicate to your colleague, I wish him well in his forecast. We have the same problems that he does.
Next question, Governor Thompson of Illinois.
Chairman Greenspan, I'd like to follow up a little bit on Terry Branstad's question, if I might. I guess maybe I'm puzzled at how Washington views its budget and its budgetary policies. In Illinois, if I had $100 million positive balance in the road fund, which fuels our transportation programs, and I had a $50 million deficit in my operating general fund, which fuels the general operations of state government, I couldn't persuade anybody that I had a $50 million positive balance in my state budget. What does the federal government budget consist of? Why is it necessary to have these dedicated trust funds which can be spent for no other purpose in some kind of unitary budget with your operating funds to cloud the issue of the deficit and goad governors and mayors to attack Washington for not giving us our money quickly enough, and provoking these decade-long arguments between secretaries of transportation and the nation's governors? What does Graham-Rudman have to do with gasoline taxes in a dedicated trust fund, and why can't we straighten this all out?
Well, Governor, I think you're raising an issue which is a very difficult one for budget process. The reason why the problem, I think, has arisen is that unlike what one would term the consolidated state budgets, the consolidated federal budget, because of the fact that they can essentially finance any amount of deficit that they want merely by printing bonds and making certain they sell in the market, because of that fact, there is a certain difference between the federal government's consolidated or unified budget than individual state budgets. I grant you that your example of the segregated funds within a state budget should not apply or should apply in the federal system, and indeed they do in a statutory sense, but from an economic point of view there is a difference, and it relates to so-called overall fiscal policy issues and indirectly to monetary policy issues, because we are involved in that financing of the federal budget. The problem basically is that in order to understand how the federal government impacts on the American economy as a whole, it makes no difference whether a surplus or a deficit is in the transportation account, even the Social Security account. What is important to the domestic savings structure of the American economy is that single figure in the unified budget. And in that sense, we are caught in a conflicting set of problems in which the processes by which programs are constructed and funded, which is the various different types of funds that we have in the federal budget, that process and the economic policy implications are really quite different and in part contradictory in the way which you suggest, Governor. And I must say to you at this stage, I'm not sure I know how to resolve that in a useful manner.
Mr. Chairman, can I follow up on that just shortly? What are we to make then of the recent arguments which assert that this is all really arguments about nothing? The governors have been concerned with the budget deficit longer than any other organized group in the nation, and yet one author recently suggests that if you measure the deficit by a different way, as a percentage of the GNP, it is not at an alarming, threatening, or structural level. It's not out of whack where history is concerned. Is he right?
I don't believe so. I think that the evidence very clearly indicates that while it is true that say roughly a 3% of GNP number is not a huge number in the international arena, there are other governments which much larger ones, we do not have adequate savings in this society to finance a budget deficit as large as 3% of our GNP. And the effect of that has been really quite corrosive in a very subtle but progressive way. And one of the reasons why, in fact, as I mentioned in my prepared remarks, we have net investment as a percent of the GNP at a very low level, is that we do not have the cash, the savings to finance it, because a significant part of our available savings are being siphoned off through the federal budget deficit.
Governor McKernan of the state of Maine.
Mr. Chairman, a couple of weeks ago, we discussed briefly the anomalous situation that many of us in the northeastern states are faced with, seeing individual income tax revenues rise in our states, but sales tax revenues really leveling off. It seems to be coincidentally some evidence that the savings rate is increasing a little bit. The question that I have is really two-part. One, would you support additional incentives for people to save more? And whether or not you would, do you see a harmful effect, at least in the short term, on the economy if that savings rate does increase significantly, given the fact that in the long term, obviously, it's in our best interest? But what would we see in the short term for that kind of a change in personal behavior?
Well, first, Governor, I think the experience that you're finding in your state revenues, namely rising individual income taxes and soft sale taxes, is mirrored actually in the federal accounts as well. There was a very large and to this date not fully understood rise in non-withheld taxes in April and May. In fact, it was so large that a number of analysts assumed that some of the weakness that occurred in retail sales occurred because of that people were caught with an unexpectedly large tax bill, both for finishing up liabilities for 1988, as well as presumably perhaps even in the estimated taxes as well. The result of that has been to sort of join with the propensity to increase the savings rate, which has occurred recently. So we've had both higher taxes and a higher savings rate, and that has taken what is a continuing rise in personal income and left us off with a surprisingly sluggish retail sales market where your sales tax revenues have run into some difficulty. It is certainly the case that the savings rate has risen. In fact, the last monthly number for June was at a 5.9% rate, which was a significant increase over earlier months. And that clearly is all to the good. Should the savings rate continue to rise in the short run, it can only come out of spending, and that would keep retail sales sluggish. However, if the savings rate now sort of tops out, and the chances are it probably will, one would assume you'll get some pickup in retail sales and under those conditions, should it occur in that way, in sales tax revenues as well.
Mr. Chairman, it's obvious that your presence and remarks here today have stimulated a great deal of interest. I think in light of your schedule and our own timetable, we will take the last three questions, which are coming from Governor Center of North Dakota, Governor Clinton of Arkansas, and Governor Campbell of South Carolina. Governor Center.
Mr. Greenspan, thank you for your work and for your very enlightening remarks. There's been a lot written about the effect of governmental turmoil in Japan with the various troubles that they've had there. Some significant effect on investment opportunities because of the phenomenon in China. Some political turmoil in Europe that has gone together with these other two and some other factors to increase flight to the dollar. And that's done a couple of things. Obviously, it has increased the value of the dollar and has pushed interest rates down here some. Is that likely to continue? Is the capping of interest rates in Japan apt to continue? And is the opposite going to happen? Is there going to be a greater security for investors in other nations, and hence the sharper demand here for investment dollars from our own economy? And or is this a very short-term thing?
Governor, you're raising just the types of questions that we in our shop debate continuously, and I'm not sure I can give you an answer which I feel comfortable with. The degree of political instability that we attribute to Japan and Germany, for example, as being factors in some exchange rate movements in recent months, is really not very major. In other words, these are not major events. They are to some financial market analysts who have to find reasons why exchange rates move as they do. And I suspect that if we didn't have that big bulge in the dollar before it turned back down again, that the issue would have gotten considerably less focus in financial markets. People always tend to look for reasons why events occur, and they will dig them up. And I'm not sure that any objective view of how one looks at those situations would conclude that there was anything really terribly serious there. We sense nothing in the markets that suggest political factors as a major force in the underlying demand. It's obviously has some effect, but I think it's very easy to overdo that as a major force driving the propensity to hold dollars in portfolios around the world.
Governor Clinton of Arkansas.
Mr. Chairman, in your remarks, you alluded to something which the governors have seen firsthand in a recent trip we took to Europe to meet with leaders of the economic community and in a number of our trips to the Far East, and that is the extraordinary level of economic cooperation among the advanced economies of the world, which tend to be able to make allowances for political problems and the individual nations and economic changes. I'd like to ask you whether you believe our knowledge about how to work together economically is the reason that we have been able to keep inflation down and economic growth going rather far beyond what traditional business cycle analysis would indicate. And if that's true, if we could continue to bring other growth economies into the orbit of policy coordination, Russia, China, Korea, Taiwan, Latin America, is it conceivable that this process could go on more or less indefinitely, that we could keep beating the odds for promoting?
That the demise of the business cycle is somewhere out there, but I doubt it. I think that so long as we have free economies functioning with people endeavoring to make judgments, there will be irrational speculation, there will be mistakes made, and there will be imbalances created both in domestic economies and the international sphere, and we will have of necessity adjustments which will be what we historically called recessions or worse. But I do think you're quite correct in raising the point that there is something that is changing here. I think it is partly the effect that services and technology and many of the issues I mentioned in my prepared remarks are changing the structure of the world economy, and it is true that our control of inventories on a worldwide basis is better than it ever has been. There is greater services relative to goods, and this is another way of coming at this conceptual versus physical volume issue, in the world gross national products. And by their nature, it is more difficult to get structural disruptions in services than in goods. And therefore, it is possible, and I underline the word possible, that we may find ourselves in a period where the intensity of the business cycle is significantly less. But that is something which is a highly debatable issue amongst the academic fraternity for good reason. Our data are just not adequate to draw that particular conclusion as yet, but it clearly is something which everyone is focusing on, and the increased integration of the world's economies. Remember, the implication of a much more rapidly rising gross world export to world GNP is that on average all of us will be increasing our imports of goods and services relative to our domestic output. And what that is suggestive of is an increased need for international integration, cooperation, and I would say that there is some sense in which that is beginning to pay off, but I would not want to carry that as yet too far.
Last question, Governor Campbell of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Greenspan, there were two items that I was very interested in. One was the impact of the federal debt on what we're dealing with, and the question concerning the counting of all of the funds in the debt for the purpose of trying to figure out what our true balance was. I'm concerned on that front. How do we treat the off-budget items, which we don't count, and we switch money in and out basically to make it look good from time to time, as we did with Social Security in the late 60s and when it was running surplus? And do you and do the economists take into consideration the off-budget item in this general creation of debt and balance? And second, in the private sector, as we have created a great deal of debt with the takeover, and addressing your other point which you made in your remarks about the changing economy of the world and the need to invest that we do in education and higher education and research, are we destroying, through the tax policies that allow the takeover and the creation of debt in that process from takeovers of companies which generally are destroying research and investment at the ground floor, is that impacting us adversely in this country? And I know there are two different questions, but I wanted to cover them there.
Well, first, Governor, we of course have full detailed data on all off-budget and federally sponsored credit agency debt, which has been rising rather rapidly. It is not dollar for dollar exactly like federal debt, meaning it doesn't have exactly the same impact on financial markets, but it is close enough to in fact be combined, and indeed most economists do combine it and look at the total, not strictly the federal debt to the public. So the answer is yes, those data are readily available, and whether it is guaranteed or not guaranteed, off-budget or not off-budget, it's part of the debt, and we all look at it in some considerable detail. There is an issue, your second question, Governor, on the takeovers, mainly the LBOs, but far more importantly, the basic restructuring of corporate America has clearly created a very significant shift from equity to debt of a very extraordinary magnitude, running in excess of $100 billion a year, shifting from equity to debt. That has induced a rise in the debt-equity ratio, which I personally find uncomfortable. And it's the result not only of LBOs and mergers and acquisitions, but also a significant amount of buyback of equity through borrowed money by the corporate sector. It's a trend I would like to see reversed, but regrettably, many of the solutions which I see offered in the Congress strike me in many respects as worse than the disease. And so I've been in a position where I would like to see certain things happen. I think, for example, that our tax structure does induce it either biases against equity in favor of debt, and I would very much like to see that reversed. The trouble, unfortunately, is to do it properly at this stage would mean a significant reduction in revenues, which in the period of endeavoring to get our budget deficit down is creating a very serious problem. So it is a major puzzle. I wish I knew the answer to your question, but we will continue to struggle with that, and hopefully successfully.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your appearance here today. Your remarks about downsizing and technology and the impact on international trade were quite stimulating to us, and your responses to our questions, I'm certain, have been helpful. It seems to me your observations about downsizing and technology are some of the most fascinating comments we've heard here in a long time. And I would suggest that there is an historical basis for that, because from the time of the appearance of the printing press to the appearance of the age of industrialization, we've had ideas and technology linked. And then with the discovery of radio and television, we've seen not only the creation of ideas, but the expansion of those ideas to distant parts of the globe. And it's interesting that As you have suggested, technology has resulted in downsizing of products. There's been an upsizing or enlargement of markets, from duchies and fiefdoms of the last century to countries and now continents where markets are much broader than ever before. It makes one wonder where all of this will end. But thank you very much for your appearance here today. I'm certain my colleagues have enjoyed it immensely. As you may recall, the Executive Committee unanimously approved a new federal budget policy at its May 16th meeting in Washington. This policy requires no further action by the Executive Committee and has been reported for a floor vote on Tuesday. As it stands now on Tuesday, Governor Campbell will move the policy and Governor Clinton will second it. Are there any questions? If not, it's time to move to update on key legislation and other issues. There are at least 5 issues on everyone's legislative agenda this year. I'd like to call on several governors to highlight our concerns on these matters. First, Governor Castle for an update on welfare reform regulations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As we all know, the Family Support Act of 1988 was passed then. And one of the requirements was that regulations would be issued by October 3rd of 1989. To the credit of Health and Human Services, they're trying to stay on that timetable. That may have led to some of the problems that we later had in terms of the regulation, the initial set of regulations that they, or draft set that they issued. But in any event, working with Bill Clinton on this issue, I delivered a collective response to the proposed regulations through congressional testimony and then in a meeting with Secretary Sullivan and some of his key assistants. And our response was, by the way, the result of a 2-day meeting in Washington for our staff, which was attended by 42 of our states. We have a number of concerns, and I won't try to detail them all, but I think we should go over 1 or 2 of them. One of those is the definition of client participation, which does not include assessment, orientation, or job development. We think that those should be included. They are included in most of our welfare reform programs in the states now. The prescriptive nature of the jobs component is a concern to us. Some of the different job components that we have now differ in terms of hours, who qualifies, those kinds of things. We think that needs to be straightened out. It particularly differs from JTPA right now. The definition of statewide-ness is an issue because of the rural and urban diversification that exists in different places. We thought it was done a little bit broadly. And we thought the data collection requirements, as in so many federal programs, were a little bit broad and too extensive and too bureaucratic as far as getting our work done. So all those things were taken up with them, and a lot more, I might add. There's a whole number of things that we've put on the table as far as they are concerned. My judgment of it is that Secretary Sullivan and his staff understand our concerns and our desires to have the flexibility necessary to meet our individual state needs. He has indicated his desire to continue working with NGA on the implementation of the Family Support Act, and I think you'll see movement in our direction in the next few months as this goes to final regulations.
Thank you. Next, Governor Clinton on child care.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank Governor Castle. The governor's worked very hard for 2 years on this welfare reform legislation, and it would be a real shame if we lost in regulation what we worked for 2 years to win in law. And a lot of you have worked very hard to get your reform programs up and going, and your people are adamantly in support of them. And in the last couple of months, because I've had to work with the legislature, I haven't been able to do as much as I had done previously, and Governor Castle has done a wonderful job protecting our interests in this debate, and I really want to thank him for that. Governor Kane and I have tried to represent you in the ongoing developments in Congress regarding child care. The governor's policy on child care, as I'm sure all of you remember, supports both a broad-based grant program and a tax credit component. The Senate has passed the Act for Better Child Care on June the 23rd. The ABC bill in its original form imposed federal minimum standards on child care and other unacceptable requirements, which we negotiated with the sponsors and particularly with Senator Dodd on over a period of many months. At the end of that period, Senator Dodd agreed to remove significant federal requirements, including the minimum standards. Tom and I tried to keep true to your orders to hang tough on the policy of not accepting any mandates, and I can report that the ABC grant program is now consistent with NGA policy. In addition to that, which is a $1.75 billion grant program, the package passed with the Senate contained tax credits to help offset the cost of child care for poor working families. The governor's policy supports these credits as they will ensure that even greater numbers of low-income families will receive direct child care assistance. Before the Senate vote on the bill, we sent a couple of letters to the Hill outlining our position, and the governor's position was mentioned frequently on both sides of the debate of that bill. On June the 27th, the House Education and Labor Committee approved Chairman Hawkins' bill, H.R. 3, which would expand Head Start, fund local school-based child care, and provide grants to states to provide child care. The committee dropped federally mandated standards as we had requested and adopted the governor's policy of model standards, but there are still many costly and troublesome mandates in that bill. The Ways and Means Committee has become involved in child care and is, during its markup of budget reconciliation, adopted a proposal to add $400 million and set aside for child care under the Title 20 Social Services Block Grant. Unfortunately, this bill also contains several onerous mandates. The Ways and Means Committee proposal also includes a tax credit component, which is an adjustment to the Earned Income Tax Credit based on family, child, and the age of the children. It's unclear to me at this time which committee's proposal will be in the reconciliation bill that goes to the House floor in September, but Governor Kane and I, with your help, will continue working to see that the final child care bill is consistent with our policy and acceptable to the states. I think we're going to get a child care bill out of this session of Congress which will help us all to provide more child care, and I hope which will be acceptable enough to the President so that he will sign the bill, and that is certainly what we're working toward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor Clinton. Now call on Governor Cunin for an update on clean air.
Thank you, Governor Beliles. Since the Executive Committee last met, we have been very active for the reauthorization of the Clean Air Act. And I testified before a House Subcommittee on Health and Environment regarding amendments. I think we all are aware of the seriousness of the situation around the country with some 100 million Americans living in areas where the air is basically unbreathable. And yesterday there was an update by the EPA even adding to that figure. The good news is that there is some action, but there is both good news and bad news. The action that we are most pleased with is that the President himself is getting a Clean Air Act bill before this year ends, before the Congress. I think we're aware that he has made this a very major issue. Many of us were present at the unveiling of the Clean Air Act last month, and I think we can all sense that this is represents a very strong effort in exercising leadership on clean air and other environmental issues. What is most of concern to us is that there seems to be some change in some of the specifics in the bill that was unveiled most recently. And comparing July figures to June, they do not comply in the same way with some of the policies that the NGA has spelled out. For example, with regard to acid rain, the President promised a 10 million ton reduction of sulfur dioxide, but the bill now delivers 9. And while the President promised to reduce nitrogen oxides by 2 million tons by the year 2000, the bill allows emissions of this acid rain-causing pollutant to increase from current levels. I would also note that the proposal does not contain a fair and equitable plan for financing emission reductions as NGA has recommended. And with regard to motor vehicles, which is a key factor, the President did not require nationwide the same level of cost-effective controls already required in California and which may soon be established in other states. So while we were extremely hopeful that action will be taken, if not this year, at the beginning of next year, and that action will probably start in the House, and while it is good news that this is part of the President's agenda, I think it's clear that the NGA has to follow this legislation very, very closely and work with the White House and the Congress in order to get a strong, workable Clean Air Act.
Thank you, Governor. Now I'd call on Governor Campbell for an update on housing and tax-exempt bonds.
I'm going to let Ray give the housing. You want to do that first, Ray?
There's essentially two major bills pending in Congress. On the Senate side, the National Affordable Housing Bill, which was introduced by Senators Cranston and D'Amato, and on the House side, the Housing and Community Development Act by Representative Gonzalez. June 6, Governors Dupuy and Governor Dukakis testified on behalf of NGA on the Senate side. In September, we will be testifying on the House side. We also expect the administration to submit their bill within the next 30 days or so, and that the markup on the Senate side will also start in September. So the housing bills are getting very ready to move forward.
All right, now, Governor.
The House Ways and Means Committee is trying to complete work on its tax bill this week, I understand, this coming week. And so far, we've been successful in our arguments. There's been voted positively a 2-year extension of mortgage revenue bonds and small issue IDBs by the Ways and Means Committee. There's been voted a permanent extension of the low-income housing tax credit. And the provisions of the treatment of tax-exempt bonds under the alternative minimum tax were kept at current law levels. If you remember, the chairman was talking about going ahead and moving them to the 100% level. They still moved to 75% in a taxable status now, but we won the skirmish. But now let me tell you what the long term may be. The committee hasn't reached agreement on how to pay for these extensions yet. One proposal that they have before them is to use funds generated by the 8% airline ticket tax for deficit reduction. I believe this would set a dangerous precedent by diverting dedicated trust funds from their original purpose. The Highway Trust Fund could well be the next if we start down that road, and that was part of a discussion we had just a moment ago, and I just thought we ought to call attention to that. They're also looking at a capital gains tax reduction as a source of revenue to raise about $5 billion in the first 2 years, then to be indexed back up to a 25% rate to keep a loss after that. I don't know where they're going to come out, but that's where we are today.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to note for the members of the Executive Committee that this year, in 1989, marks the 25th anniversary of our affiliate of the Council of State Policy and Planning Agencies, and I hope you will join me in congratulating them on the occasion. This organization has been of great value to us and our senior policy advisors. It's especially fitting that the relationship with NGA has just been renewed, and they'll be working with us in our Policy Academy very closely in the next year or so as we develop strategic policies for families and youth at risk. I'd like to extend our congratulations to them on that 25th anniversary. I'm sorry, I overlooked Governor Center for an update on mail order sales tax collection. Governor?
As you know, the situation presently in the United States makes a mockery of the state sales tax concept, with the court decision prohibiting us from forcing out-of-state sellers to collect the sales tax. Just to give you an idea of how serious it is, the average net profit of U.S. retailers is somewhere in the area of 2.5% of gross sales. They suffer a real disadvantage of approaching 5 to 6, 7%, whatever that sales tax factor is, in competing with out-of-state sellers, and it is an outrageous disadvantage and an outrageous fairness. Congressman Brooks, Jack Brooks, of the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, has introduced House Resolution 2230, and the Congress has literally been plagued by a deluge of postcard mails, letters from people that were encouraged to send letters to Congress by mail order catalogs. Huge amounts of money are being spent to fight this bill. But in spite of that, I want to report to you that some progress is being made. We have in the committee, if you add up the leaning yes and the clear yeses, we have a slight majority. Now, all I have to say is you simply must help us get your state agency people, everybody, to write in to the members of Congress to encourage them to support this. The state of Illinois has sent a letter to all members of Congress signed by a bipartisan group of state officials. get your retailers, your Main Street retailers to help us, because Congress is literally being plagued with an onslaught of negative opposition to this. That's really all I have to say, I think. Let me see. One other thing. Everything that's possibly can be done in your states to press legally for the collection of these taxes does pay some dividends. North Dakota has just gotten 2 major catalog companies to concede to the collection of taxes, and you absolutely must keep the pressure on there for the fairness of your own retailers.
Thank you, Governor. I'd like now to call on Governor Castle, Chairman of the Committee on Justice and Public Safety. As you may recall, the members of this committee will, Governor Castle faced a difficult challenge last year as Chairman of the Human Resources Committee in persuading Congress, along with Governor Clinton, to address the governor's concerns on welfare reform. Now he has a difficult challenge of stopping drug abuse and reducing prison overcrowding. And I'm going to ask him to briefly outline the progress of the committee now, recognizing that the full committee will meet tomorrow for a very extended discussion of these concerns. Governor Castle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought perhaps you were going to ask me to give the solution to those problems in 30 seconds or so, which I'm certainly not ready to do. I think all of us are facing the same thing that I'm facing in my General Assembly and in my state, and that is that drugs are on the minds of everybody, and everybody's trying to pass legislation and do different things to solve the problems. And this came, I think, to a head in our organization a year ago in Cincinnati, when there was certainly a groundswell of interest for focusing on a national drug problem and a number of suggestions of how we should organize that issue. We made a decision at that time to assign a lead governor within the Justice and Public Safety Committee to focus on the drug problem. And Governor Martinez, who's with us here today, was good enough to agree to take on this responsibility. He has worked over the past year to bring our NGA policy on this issue up to date. He has spent considerable time learning firsthand about the drug trafficking problem, and he will bring us up to date on this issue at this time. I must say that Governor Martinez was involved in this issue long before it seemed to become the issue of the particular moment in this country. He's been doing this for many years, so we're delighted to have Governor Martinez to present where NGA is on this.
Thank you, Governor Castle, Governor Bliles. Before you, you've got a copy of a draft report, which is the survey, which I want to compliment Nolan Jones for the good work he's done in preparing. It is preliminary. There's still information to be gathered from several states and to refine the information so that information that you see in there that you like to perhaps make further inquiry, well, please feel free to do so, since this is not the final report. But we thought a good place to start is to see where we are, and that's why the survey was needed. And I think it shows clearly that the governors have been at the front line, that if you look at all the states and assess the information that's been gathered here, that states have been quite innovative in developing programs all the way from drug policy councils to drug czars to all forms of activities for enforcement on the demand side, on the supply side. And I think from this report, this survey, that perhaps some of us can get a shortcut in terms of what else we may need to do in our own state. I think what's important too is that we're finding regional cooperation. I know in the southern region of the country we have had at least one meeting in Florida, and I noticed that here, I believe, in Chicago, there's going to be a meeting of the Mid-Atlantic governors. I believe that this is something that's important too, because not only is a national policy, but I think you can, particularly to the law enforcement side, do an awful lot on a regional basis. The one thing that I think all of us have found is that they're in a community that is not impacted. There certainly is not a state that is not impacted. And it's an outcry by the public in terms of what needs to be done. And if you look at the budgets, whether it's federal, state, or local, you'll find a tremendous skewing of resources to deal with the issue of drugs and crime and, of course, prisons. And unless we get a hold of this issue, it's going to have a tremendous impact in terms of our ability to pay for items such as education, because we're spending so much just to keep the neighborhood free of drugs and of course, safe. I would suggest also that in these packets that you have before you, that's not tourism material from Florida. Whatever's in that packet's all drug related, so it's not a question of coming to Florida. So it's all materials having to do with the issue of drugs and crime. And we suggest that you take that information and let your staff examine it. This is an accumulation of data that I think will be helpful. Later on in the conference, we will have some specific recommendations to make in terms of what we ought to be recommending to Washington. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor. I'd like now to call on Ray Shapak, our Executive Director, for a brief financial report.
Just two quick issues as updates. In spite of Governor Belial's ambitious agenda, we seem to manage to finish the fiscal year with a surplus of about $30,000 to $40,000, so we're happy about that. Second, we are now encouraged that we have 23 corporate fellows as members. The actual corporations are listed in tab F of your agenda book.
Thank you, Ray. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that concludes our agenda. Let me remind the governors that there is a governors-only informal luncheon in rooms Columbus C and D, to the back of the room and to the left. Any other business? Governor Campbell.
One thing, not for formal business, but to the attention of all of the members here. The Association of Adjutants General, all of your Adjutants General, adopted a resolution of concern about the funding and manning of selective service stations, the selective service system across the states. This matter is being looked at by staff now, and I'm sure they'll bring something back, but if any of them happen to call it to your attention, it is just something I just wanted to bring out for you to be aware of.
Any other comments? Questions? If there's no other business to come before the committee, this meeting is adjourned.